For April Fools, I have decided to cover the biggest joke that I could think of, and that's the site Userbenchmark. First of all, I have nothing against this site. In fact, I love it. It's very entertaining. If you use it like I do, then there's nothing wrong with it. Just don't use it for anything other than entertainment, because the site isn't what it seems. Because whoever writes the product summaries on this site really hates AMD. It has become a habit for me to regularly look up products on this site to see what they have to say on them, because without fail, they'll praise Intel and shun AMD. And this has only got more entertaining as AMD's products have got better. It wasn't hard to criticise AMD's processors a few years ago, because Intel really was a lot better than AMD. This is probably why I didn't know about this site until relatively recently, because their views on products were quite similar to everybody else's on the topic at the time. But all this changed with Ryzen, which was when AMD's products were suddenly actually rather good again. With every generation of Ryzen processor, AMD has closed the gap with Intel. They have gained market share, and with it, this site's biases have become increasingly apparent. And with the latest products, the summaries are literally ridiculous. We'll start this story in 2016. AMD processors sucked, and Intel processors went up to 4 cores, 8 threads, and had done for many years. If you wanted anything more than that, you had to spend a lot of money on it. But all this changed in 2017 when AMD released the Ryzen 1000 series. At any given price point, AMD offered more cores and threads than Intel did. Most famously, their 1600 processor offered 12 threads for $220, which was 3 times more threads than Intel's competing i5s had. Although a bit behind for single-core performance, it was an absolute bloodbath in anything multi-threaded. The flagship product was the Ryzen 1800X, 8 cores, 16 threads. There wasn't much point in getting this since the cheaper models offered similar specs for a lot less money, but I'm showing you this one so that you know what Userbenchmark was like back then. They loved this processor. They say it offers a staggering level of multi-core performance, and I agree with all of that. In fact, they're even more generous than I am by saying that it's only 9% behind Intel's CPU for IPC, when I think in practice it was often slower than this. Not that it mattered much since it was still very fast, and the increased number of cores more than made up for it. But yeah, there you have it. In 2017, Userbenchmark thought AMD's Ryzen processors were excellent. They called the 1600 the best value for money 6-core CPU they had seen to date. And they're even kind on the Ryzen 3 CPUs, which, of the lineup, were arguably the weakest competition. But Userbenchmark still sings their praises and points out their strengths. All in all, I agree completely with this site in 2017, which might be why I didn't know much about it back then. Later that year, Intel released their first mainstream 6-core processor, the i7-8700K, and it was a good one, and I agree with Userbenchmark's summary on this product as well, stating that it's a lot better. They even acknowledge how good AMD is, saying that Intel once again has to compete. Now on to 2018 and the Ryzen 2000 series. And this is where the fun starts. Of all the Ryzen generations, the 2000 series was the smallest step up, being just a refined version of the 1000 series, but it still offered more performance for less money than before. But Userbenchmark didn't like this one as much. They acknowledge that it offers better value for money for workstation users, but that streamers should look elsewhere, implying they'll drop frames with this processor. I don't think I disagree with any of this, but it seems odd that they'd mentioned this on the 2700X's page, with it being the most capable processor for this sort of activity at the time. They do at least point out that it beats Intel for multi-core, but say that it is slower if you limit it to a single or quad-core situation, which I agree with. But this would all change with AMD's Ryzen 3000 series, which was where AMD finally closed the gap and matched Intel for single-core performance. Just weeks before the Ryzen 3000 series came out, however, Userbenchmark changed how they rated processors. With more and more processors with more than 4 cores being released, the site decided to change the ratings to favour fewer cores. Single core was bumped up from 30% to 40% of a processor's result. Quad core was dropped down from 60 to 57%, and multi-core, the rating that accounted for the whole processor, was dropped from 10% down to just 2%. They argued that multi-core performance isn't suitable for desktop PCs because typical workloads rarely exceed 2 cores. That's right. Userbenchmark thinks you only need 2 cores. This change to how processors were reviewed was great for Intel, which up until then were typically faster than AMD CPUs per core. With so much emphasis on single core, however, strange situations began to arise where a flagship AMD CPU would get beaten by Intel's cheapest, which bore no resemblance to real-life performance whatsoever. There were many crazy examples of this happening, really silly looking stuff. Even the uninformed viewer would look at this and think something strange was going on. Userbenchmark basically became a meme with this sort of stuff, and before long their site was banned from places around the internet. You can understand it getting banned from AMD's subreddit, but Userbenchmark had become such a meme that it even got banned from Intel's subreddit, because their site no longer made any sense whatsoever, and its results no longer conformed with reality. But like I said, just a few weeks after this change, the Ryzen 3000 series came out, and finally AMD achieved parity with Intel in all but fringe cases. They offered similar single-core performance and better multi-core performance to Intel processors. And this is where Userbenchmark's summaries began to get very interesting indeed. Now AMD wasn't behind in any meaningful way, so you'd think that Userbenchmark would be forced to start praising AMD's processors, but the summary slagged it off for being bundled with a free cooler. It then went off on a lengthy tangent about overclocking with a custom cooler, and then spent the second half of the review slagging AMD off for offering worse eFPS. What is eFPS? Userbenchmark argues that FPS doesn't fully represent the FPS you get, so created an alternative measurement of FPS that only they seem to be able to measure called eFPS. How does this work? I'm not really sure. It seems like they manually record benchmarks using all kinds of CPUs and GPUs, though recent CPUs have only been tested with the GeForce 2060 Super, which limits eFPS's potential somewhat. Surprise surprise, AMD performs badly in these tests. For instance, the 10700K is 12% faster than the new Ryzen 5600X is in Fortnite. The 9600K is still 11% faster, and even the Ryzen 3 600 is 9% faster. Either Userbenchmark is wrong here, or the entire rest of the world is. Who am I to say? In one of the videos explaining eFPS, they showcase AMD hardware stuttering terribly in games. I believe they claim these stutters are something to do with AMD's inferior memory controllers and latency compared with Intel, which comes as a result of AMD using multiple chips connected together instead of one big one. There's some truth to the memory latency here, but strangely, it's only Userbenchmark that shows it impacting results so noticeably and catastrophically. So there you go. AMD CPUs are worse than Intel's. And this is where my fascination with the site comes from, because with each generation of CPUs, I excitedly read all of the reviews for them, look at all of the benchmarks, and then jump on over to this site to see how they've managed to twist the results to make AMD look bad, and Intel good. And I have a treat for you, because the story doesn't end here. Because the new generation of AMD and Intel CPUs have been released, and AMD's Ryzen 5000 series is better in every measurable metric. It's fast for multi-core, it's the fastest for single-core, and the memory latency is less than anything else out there. So let's see what Userbenchmark has to say about the 5800X, the fastest 8-core 16-thread CPU out there. They say it's better value than another AMD CPU, but I even disagree with this statement. But then they go on to say that it doesn't stand a chance against Intel, claiming that Intel's much cheaper 9600K is just as good as the 5800X, and that gamers that do not wish to pay marketing fees can invest those savings in a better GPU. So suddenly, when AMD is faster than Intel in every conceivable measurement, Userbenchmark then argues that none of this matters because you can save money by getting a cheaper CPU. Incredible. To be honest, I do agree. I don't get their fixation on gaming and only gaming, but gaming is much more about the GPU than it is about the CPU. So let's take a look at a cheap, fast 4-core AMD CPU like the 3300X. And suddenly they flipped back to AMD isn't fast enough, while finding space to praise Intel for its encoding performance, which is nothing to do with gaming. Like I said, I am endlessly entertained by Userbenchmark's imagination and creativity. It's written to confirm the biases of people who already think that Intel's the best, or to convince people who don't understand hardware enough to know any better. But I do know my hardware, and I can see exactly what they're doing here. They know they're being dishonest because they're happy to use half-truths whenever it benefits their purpose to do so, but only when it benefits them. These half-truths may be half true, but it's the half that isn't that's being used to mislead people here. Like, anybody who knows their stuff will be rightfully pissed off with this bit, where they claim there's no upgrade path for gamers beyond the 3300X, so they'll be forced to buy a new Intel system. What a kick in the teeth, given how this Ryzen platform will allow you to slip in a far more powerful processor into the system than the Intel one will. What a manipulative way of wording. If you demand a single-digit performance increase in gaming, you must buy a new PC. And then to have the nerve to shoot down AMD's powerful CPUs as being too expensive whenever they outperform Intel. It's manipulative, it's deceptive, and they 100% know what they're doing. And then to play the victim and to accuse everybody else of being paid shills. Stroke of manipulative genius right there. I could spend hours and hours trying to untangle their web of half-truths, but there's a much simpler explanation. For any Intel CPU, they praise it on what it is, while for any AMD CPU, it's criticised for what it isn't. So the next thing I'm looking forward to is how they choose to rate the upcoming 4-core AMD APUs, which seem to have everything they want. Like, I can't personally see how they can possibly criticise them, but I know they'll find a way. The problem with this site is that it's big and influential among people who know nothing about computer hardware other than whatever comes top of Google search, which, more often than not, is Userbenchmark's site. But to see such brazen favouritism from such a large site, it's staggering. It has reached alternative facts levels of deception. It's trying to rewrite reality, and I'm not sure why. They claim there's some kind of global conspiracy against them, but their disdain for the rest of the community simply comes across as hostile and unprofessional. Their site isn't just disagreeing with other sites, they are contradicting the very things that they used to say themselves. Since their glowing review of Ryzen in 2017, AMD's processors have only become better and more competitive with Intel, yet their reviews of them have only become more negative and increasingly full of hatred, unnecessary, unwarranted hatred. Something is going on behind the scenes here. There has to be. I accept that no matter how good AMD's processors are, Williams and Blackton will never acknowledge that they're better than Intel's. But here's a thought. What if, instead of AMD's processors being good, what if Intel's processors were bad? Like, so bad that nobody could write a good review about them. Intel's newest flagship product, the 11900K, is not a good processor. Every review of it has said the same thing. It's hot and it's power hungry, and its cores aren't even the fastest anymore. Plus it's priced terribly, being way too expensive for what it is, putting its 8 cores in direct comparison with AMD's vastly superior 12-core processor, and even Intel's superior previous gen 10-core product. It's a joke. Oh, Userbenchmark. All of your shifting goalposts, all of your odd skews of perception, they've backed you into a corner, and it's all come pouring out gloriously in your review of Intel's 11900K. I can be as scathing as I like about Userbenchmark, but nothing makes them look worse than their very own words. Ladies and gentlemen, for April Fools, I proudly present to you Userbenchmark's fully serious, supposedly professional review of Intel's latest flagship processor. Rocket Lake's IPC uplift translates to around 10% faster effective speed than both Intel's 10th gen and AMD's 5000 series. Despite Intel's performance lead, AMD continues to outsell Intel. Given Intel's colossal R&D operation, it's bewildering that their marketing seems so neglected. Little effort is made to counter widespread disinformation such as, it uses too much electricity, or the classic, it needs more cores. Intel samples are often distributed to reviewers that appear better incentivized to bury Intel's products rather than review them realistically. Not enabling XMP or only testing with BIOS power limits enabled is akin to leaving the handbrake on during a timed lap. Sackable. A mind-numbing list of irrelevant, scientific, and rendering benchmarks are presented as gospel. When it's convenient, unrepresentative canned game benchmarks are chosen, e.g. Electrical's CSGO, which runs at nearly double the in-game FPS. Different games, mostly unplayed by real users, are cherry-picked for user review. At every release, AMD's marketers circle overhead coordinating narratives to ensure another feast of blue bubba ensues. Credible benchmark data, which necessarily includes replicable video footage from popular games, is the exception rather than the rule. Nonetheless, towards the end of 2021, Intel's Golden Cove is due to offer an additional 20 to 30% performance increase. At that time, with a net 30 to 40% performance lead, Intel will probably regain significant market share, despite AMD's class-leading marketing.